Have you ever wondered about the origins of the Canaanites? A people so deeply entwined with darkness that their very existence was marked by a cursed origin. A people who dwelled in the land, promised to Israel, yet practiced unspeakable rituals and worshipped gods so terrifying they demanded the unimaginable. Baal, Ashtaroth, and Molech, names that echo through history with dread and horror. These deities were not mere myths, but terrifying gods who demanded the most horrifying sacrifices, including innocent children offered on demonic altars. But what was it that drove a nation to such extremes? Why did God decree their utter destruction, sparing no mercy? Was it truly about the land, or was there something deeper at play? Today, we will uncover the chilling truth about the Canaanites and the religion they followed, a truth that still has echoes in the world today. Are you ready to take a deeper look into the dark heart of ancient rituals that almost overtook Israel? Let's uncover the shocking history that has been hidden for centuries. Comment 777 if you're ready to dive into this story and discover why these gods almost brought Israel to ruin. Keep reading because the full revelation is about to unfold, and it might just leave you speechless. The origins of the Canaanites and the horrific gods they worshipped. From the very first breaths of Genesis, it becomes clear that nothing recorded in the Bible is mere coincidence or idle storytelling. Every genealogy, those long lists of names we so often skim past, acts like a hidden network of spiritual roots, nourishing the grand unfolding saga of God's dealings with humanity. It's there, tucked away in Genesis 10:6, that we first encounter a name destined to echo ominously through the corridors of sacred history Canaan. The verse reads simply, "And the sons of Ham, Cush and Mizraim, and Put and Canaan," almost as if Canaan were just another branch on the vast family tree after the flood. Yet under the penetrating light of Scripture, this seemingly unremarkable mention transforms into a profound signpost, marking the rise of a people who would dramatically shape Israel's destiny politically, yes, but even more so in the hidden battles of the Spirit. What is most startling and perhaps even troubling is that the curse tied to the name of Canaan did not spring from anything he personally did. Instead, the shadows that gathered over his lineage were cast by the misstep of his father Ham. Picture the raw human scene in Genesis 9:22-25. Noah, the righteous man who had walked so closely with God that he was spared from the flood, now lay exposed in his tent, drunk and uncovered. Ham stumbled upon his father's nakedness, and though the text shrouds the incident in an unsettling ambiguity, it hints at a transgression weighty enough to ripple through generations. Then comes Noah's chilling declaration, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be unto his brethren." Why was it Canaan, innocent by all appearances, who bore the burden of this curse, rather than Ham himself? Some scholars wonder if young Canaan already showed disturbing glimpses of the moral decay that would one day define his descendants. Pride that defies all restraint, a hunger for sensual pleasures, and a dangerous openness to idolatry. Could it be that God, who sees into the hearts of men and the destinies of nations before they unfold, was unveiling a prophetic glimpse of where this line would inevitably lead? Or was this curse a solemn banner raised in advance, warning of the corrupt paths the Canaanites would later choose? plunging headlong into practices so dark that God's own holiness would be stirred to action. Pause for a moment. Can you imagine being part of a family line where choices made long before you were born seemed to set the course of your future? What might it feel like to sense a shadow trailing your steps, whispering of destinies shaped by ancestors you never knew? And yet, woven into this sobering account is also a deeper thread about divine justice, one that would reappear centuries later when Israel stood poised to enter the promised land. It's as though God was sketching out from the earliest chapters a stark contrast between a people called to holiness and those who would plunge themselves into the depths of idolatry and unspeakable rites. Could it be that even today, we too are sometimes confronted by spiritual legacies we did not choose, but which invite us to break cycles and step into something far greater? This beginning isn't just a dull genealogical note tucked away in an ancient record. It's a living, pulsing theological foreshadowing, one that stretches its dark fingers through time to grip the very soul of Israel's unfolding destiny. The line of Canaan would one day blossom into nations infamous for a corruption so deep it seemed to breathe through every stone and shadow of their land. Think of it: entire societies built on the twisted pillars of temple prostitution, blood-soaked altars demanding the lives of children, and wild frenzies before gods with names like Baal, Ashtaroth, and Molech. These horrific rituals were not random outbursts of wickedness. They were the eerie resonance of an ancestral curse echoing through generations, proof that God's judgments were never accidents, but the outworking of a divine justice that sees with perfect clarity. But pause and let your heart feel the weight of this question. Why did God take such deliberate care to record the precise origin of these people? Why did the Spirit ensure these unsettling details would be inscribed forever in sacred scripture? The answer pulses with urgency, because Israel's entire saga in the Promised Land makes no sense without grasping who the Canaanites truly were and why their destiny had already been traced by divine decree. Here is where the deep undercurrents of biblical theology start to tug us into the next darker chapter. We're not simply dealing with a people cursed for something in their distant past. They would be cursed for what they would one day freely and fiercely choose to become. Return with me to one of the most haunting moments in the Bible, captured in Genesis 9:24-25. The text almost trembles under the weight of what it conveys. And Noah awoke from his wine, and knew what his younger son had done unto him. And he said, Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be unto his brethren. At first glance, doesn't it seem wildly unfair? Ham was the one who trespassed, yet it is Canaan, his innocent grandson, who becomes the lightning rod for Noah's solemn curse. How many today would cry injustice if they were there to witness it? Yet the Spirit of God beckons us to look deeper, to pierce beyond the veil of surface offense, and glimpse the spiritual architecture behind Noah's chilling words. For centuries, scholars and sages have wrestled with this moment, some arguing over its moral implications, others trying to decode the hidden symbolism. But one truth stands unshakable. This was no mere flash of human anger. Noah, chosen vessel and patriarch, was moved by something higher, an unseen hand guiding his tongue to utter a prophecy that would shape the fate of nations. In that declaration, he did more than pronounce a punishment. He exposed a destiny that was already spiritually embedded in Canaan's line. Imagine standing there hearing this curse ring out across the earth's fresh new beginnings. After the flood, would your heart not have clenched in fear, wondering what future horrors these words might unlock? Canaan himself fades quickly from the text, but the fruit of his lineage grows monstrous before our eyes. As history unfolds, we see his descendants rise up as the Hittites, Jebusites, Amorites, Perizzites, a haunting parade of nations that filled the land with every abomination the God of Israel despised. This territory, which would ironically be promised to God's chosen people as a sanctuary of holiness, had already become a stronghold of depravity. Can you picture the grim scenes? Children's cries silenced on altars to Molech priests and priestesses, sinking into acts of sacred sexual immorality. Unholy fires crackling in temples where demons were welcomed as gods. All of it rooted in a defiance of Yahweh, so blatant it seemed almost eager. And here, we brush against a sobering mystery of divine justice. This curse on Canaan was not simply a divine strike against one fleeting act. It was a revelation that God judges not only isolated deeds, but also the broader roads chosen by entire peoples. Some might recoil at this, but does not. The Lord who searches hearts and weighs spirits see the end from the beginning. He knew that from Canaan's seed would sprout a culture intoxicated with darkness, thrilled by idols, and defiantly opposed to his holiness. Is it possible that even today we carry unseen legacies, blessings or battles that began long before us? Could there be patterns in our families or societies that trace back to choices once made with reckless abandon? As we journey deeper into this story, watch closely how this curse was not merely a verdict against the past. It was a prophetic seed sown deep into the soil of human history, destined to grow into bitter fruit. That seed would one day blossom into direct confrontations with God's people, infecting the very land meant to be a canvas of divine purity and separation. So as we step into the next chapters, hold this tension in your heart. Because these ancient shadows are not just relics of a distant past, they still whisper lessons to us now about the staggering power of choices, the weight of generational paths, and the relentless call of God to stand apart from the seductive pull of a world gone mad. If you were an Israelite hearing these stories by firelight, would your resolve to honor Yahweh burn even fiercer, knowing what awaited beyond the Jordan? Or would fear creep in, sensing how easily any nation can slide from blessing into curse? The Bible is astonishingly precise when it lays out the boundaries of Canaan, a detail that might seem like dry geography at first, but is in fact charged with deep spiritual significance. In Genesis 10:19, we find these ancient borders carefully traced, and the border of the Canaanites was from Sidon, as thou comest to Gerar unto Gaza, as thou goest unto Sodom and Gomorrah, and Admah, and Zeboim, even unto Lasha. This was no idle cartographer's sketch. These lines on the map would soon become the very stage upon which one of history's fiercest struggles between light and darkness would play out, a clash pitting the seductive, bloody gods of Canaan against the holy, jealous God of Israel. Nestled strategically between Egypt's mighty empire and the grand civilizations of Mesopotamia, this land was like a crossroads of the ancient world. Caravans thick with spices, gold, and exotic wares traveled its dusty roads. Ideas, languages, and customs mingled freely under its sun. But with that wealth and traffic also came a tidal wave of moral decay. Have you ever wondered why some places seem almost destined to become arenas of temptation and testing? Canaan was just such a place. Its fertile valleys promised lush harvests, while its fortified cities gleamed like jewels set in stone. Yet beneath that promise lurked spiritual dangers so potent they would threaten the very identity of God's chosen people. Look closer, and you'd find this land teeming with nations that bore the same shadowed lineage descendants of Canaan, who each added their own dark colors to the canvas of corruption. Hittites, Amorites, Canaanites proper, Perizzites, Hivites, Jebusites, all names that would one day send chills down Israelite spines. Each tribe upheld spiritual practices so deeply opposed to God's ways that their cities became living altars to defiance. Imagine strolling through the bustling streets of a city like Jericho or Sidon, merchants hawking fine linens, children chasing each other between market stalls, priests chanting hypnotic invocations to Baal or Ashtaroth under towering temple columns. Could you feel how the very air seemed charged with a spiritual presence, yet one utterly foreign and hostile to the God who spoke to Abraham under the stars? These were not harmless local customs. This was a land brimming with sacred prostitution, meant to arouse the favor of fertility gods, where parents driven by terror or twisted devotion offered up their own sons and daughters to be burned alive before Molech. Can you fathom the screams echoing through the night, the drums trying to drown out the agony, as a priest's hands lifted yet another innocent child toward the flames? And all the while, these rituals stood as direct affronts to the covenant. God had already pledged to Abraham, "Unto thy seed will I give this land." Genesis 12:7. Was this why God was so meticulous in describing Canaan's expanse? Because every city, every high place, every grove was a spiritual battleground already occupied by forces intent on resisting his holiness. As the descendants of Canaan fanned out, they claimed ground from the shimmering Mediterranean all the way to the banks of the Jordan. Their influence seeped from the sun-baked Negev desert in the south to the lush northern hills of Phoenicia, Jericho's imposing walls, Hebron's ancient streets, Sidon's bustling harbors, and Gaza's fortified gates all became centers where pagan worship pulsed like a dark heart. Each time a child was laid on a stone altar or a temple, prostitute was embraced in a so-called sacred union, it was a bold proclamation that this land was spiritually aligned against everything Yahweh stood for. And isn't there a sobering lesson hidden here for us today? Could entire cultures still build altars to modern idols? Fame, greed, unbridled pleasure, forgetting the covenant truths that once shaped them. As you picture the land of Canaan, crowded with shrines and echoing with forbidden chants, try to place yourself among the Israelites who would soon be commanded to cross these very borders. Would your faith falter knowing what lay ahead, or would it burn hotter, determined to stand for a God whose holiness could not coexist with the shadows? In the end, these boundaries were more than lines on a parchment. They were divine markers outlining a territory soaked in spiritual peril, yet destined by promise, a land where God's story of redemption and judgment would unfold in breathtaking, terrifying drama. And this drama was only just beginning. Now pause and truly think about this with me for a moment. Isn't it astonishing, almost unsettling, that the very land God promised to Abraham, a land flowing with milk and honey, destined to be a cradle of divine blessing, was at the time of the promise, already teeming with peoples steeped in the vilest of abominations. Does this not stir something deep in your spirit? This wasn't some random coincidence. It was the mysterious hand of divine providence at work. In calling Abraham's descendants to inherit that territory, God was simultaneously issuing a summons for its purification. The conquest of Canaan was never meant to be a mere political takeover. It was an act of divine judgment, and Israel was to be the chosen instrument of that holy reckoning. As we watch the Canaanites multiplying and spreading their influence from city to fortified city, we begin to see that their territorial expansion was far more than geographical growth. It was the rapid, relentless spread of a culture that stood in outright defiance of the living God. Every new settlement they founded, every towering altar erected to a false deity, was like raising a clenched fist toward heaven, daring God's patience. Can you sense how each festival, each sacrifice, each seductive ceremony was tightening the divine timetable? The more the Canaanites flourished outwardly, the nearer approached the hour when heaven's justice would finally collide with their corruption. The land was mapped, the nations entrenched, and the stage meticulously prepared for a cosmic showdown between Yahweh's holiness and the brazen idols of Canaan. When we delve into the heart of Canaanite society, it becomes shockingly clear that their entire way of life was fused like flesh to bone to their religious devotion. Nothing was neutral. Public gatherings, family customs, trade agreements, even sexual practices were drenched in the demands of their pantheon. Their cities might impress any visitor with their impressive walls, clever irrigation, and bustling markets. But if you lingered long enough, you would smell the rot beneath the perfume. This was a civilization advanced by human standards, yet spiritually decaying at its core. Isn't it a haunting thought how easy it is for prosperity to mask profound moral collapse? Promiscuity wasn't a private vice in Canaan. It was publicly sanctified as worship. Men and women flocked to the temples of Asherah and Ashtaroth, where ritual sex acts were performed openly, all in a desperate bid to secure the god's blessing over their crops and herds. Imagine living in a world where drunken revelries weren't merely tolerated, but praised as sacred duty. Where children grew up watching their parents dance half-naked around altars, taught from the cradle that pleasure was the highest offering they could bring to heaven. And the darkness didn't end at sensual excess. It tunneled its way even deeper into the very heart of the family. Parents stood by, eyes glazed with fanatic zeal, as priests led their young sons and daughters to Molech's molten embrace. Little bodies tossed into the searing arms of bronze statues, heated from within flames, swallowing cries that would echo forever if stone could remember. Could your heart bear witness to such scenes without breaking? The Lord himself called these acts abominations in Leviticus 18, warning Israel with stern clarity. After the doings of the land of Canaan, ye shall not do, neither shall ye walk in their ordinances. What would it take for God to carve out such explicit prohibitions, if not the sheer horror of what was commonplace there? Canaanite culture was not simply foreign to Israel. It was a spiritual contagion, a moral acid that corroded everything it touched. Their entire value system stood in brazen opposition to Yahweh's commands. Where God called for holiness, they exalted lust. Where he cherished and protected life, they casually ended it on demon altars. Where he established justice and compassion, they sowed injustice witchcraft, and relentless idolatry. And yet this is perhaps the most dangerous twist. It was all so intoxicating. Their ceremonies dazzled the senses. Music, dance, ornate symbols, flowing garments, festivals drenched in wine and song. It was a heady perfume that drifted through the valleys of Canaan, enticing even the most well-meaning to taste its poison. Is it any wonder, then, that God, in His sovereign mercy, demanded that this culture be entirely rooted out, not from cruelty, but from a divine urgency to protect Israel from being seduced into the same abyss? Can you imagine if the Israelites had shrugged off these dangers as mere cultural quirks? How long before their own children would have stood trembling before Molech's furnace? But what exactly did this poisonous spirituality look like in day-to-day worship? Who were these dark entities that so hungrily devoured blood pleasure and human dignity? To grasp the full horror of the Canaanite world, and to understand why God's justice burned so hot against it, we must now step even closer. Together, we'll peer behind the veil and meet the dreadful gods they served to see firsthand the monstrous appetites that ruled Canaan's soul. Are you ready to walk with me into these shadowed temples, to witness the depths to which a people can fall when they turn from the living God? The religion of the Canaanites was not just a collection of primitive superstitions. It was a sophisticated, highly structured spiritual counterfeit. But make no mistake, it was also deeply perverse, a demonic distortion of what true worship to the Creator was meant to be. Imagine a world where every sacred symbol was inverted, every holy truth twisted, every divine principle turned inside out. While Israel stood at the foot of Sinai, trembling as the voice of the Lord carved His law into stone, the Canaanites were entangling themselves in a spiritual system that looked powerful on the surface, but was rotten to the core. Their worship was not a quiet personal choice. It was the very heartbeat of their civilization. Everything in Canaanite, society, politics, harvests, weather-sex war, family roles flowed directly from their religious framework. It wasn't just that religion played a central role. It was that religion was the system. Can you imagine living in a culture where every decision from royal decrees to planting seeds in the ground had to pass through the demands of bloodthirsty gods? This was a world where spiritual darkness didn't hide in the shadows. It ruled from the mountaintops, literally. At the pinnacle of their twisted spiritual order stood what could only be described as a profane trinity. First came Baal, the god of storms, fertility, and dominance over nature. He was seen as the giver of rain and crops, but also as the one who demanded loyalty through violent ritual. Alongside him stood Ashtaroth, goddess of war, sensuality, and fertility, who seduced through beauty, but enslaved through lust. She was venerated in ways that blurred every line between sacred and sensual. Then there was Asherah, sometimes viewed as Baal's consort, or the feminine force tied to El, the so-called father of the gods. These weren't symbolic figures. They were believed to walk among the people in spirit, demanding daily devotion in the form of ritualized perversion. But perhaps the darkest figure of them all was Molech, the silent, burning god with outstretched bronze arms. He did not ask for praise or offerings of grain. He asked for children. Can you picture the terror in a child's eyes, the numb acceptance in the face of a parent, offering their own flesh and blood to flames, believing they were honoring the divine? This was not just idol worship. This was carnage presented as sanctity. Could you have stood in those temples without trembling? Could you have watched without weeping? These temples, built on high places, elevated hills, visible from afar, were not places of peace and prayer. Scripture refers to them repeatedly with dread and disdain. They were arenas of darkness where orgies masqueraded as worship, drunken feasts were rites of fertility, and even gladiator-style combat was considered sacred entertainment. The altars weren't clean. They were stained with blood, sometimes animal, but often human. And the idols, grotesque, sensual, and demonic in appearance, stood as silent witnesses to the depth of depravity that had taken root in the land. Many were designed with open arms, not to embrace, but to receive the burning bodies of living sacrifices. Does that image not sear into your conscience? This wasn't merely superstition. The Bible makes it clear that something more sinister was at play. In Deuteronomy 32:17, Moses unveils the terrifying truth. They sacrificed unto devils, not to God, to gods whom they knew not. What appeared to be cultural ritual was in fact communion with demons. The Canaanite religion was a fully functioning system of demonic worship, one that took all the sacred things God had made good, the human body, sexual intimacy, family structure, acts of worship, and desecrated them beyond recognition. But perhaps the most chilling revelation is that it worked, at least in the eyes of man. The crops grew, the cities prospered, trade routes flourished, children were born, rain fell, gold passed from hand to hand. From a human perspective, the system seemed not only functional, it was successful. Isn't that the true danger? When evil cloaks itself in results. This is what made Canaanite religion so dangerously seductive. It promised immediate reward, visible success, and full social approval. There was no need for repentance, no call to holiness, no truth that pierced the soul. Only pleasure, power, and performance. In this light, can you now see why God didn't view the Canaanites simply as hostile tribes occupying territory meant for Israel? No, he saw them as something much more dangerous, a full-blown organized rebellion against his divine order, a system designed to challenge his holiness and enslave the very souls he longed to redeem. That is why when judgment was decreed, it came not from the anger of a tyrant, but from the justice of a holy God, protecting his people from being swallowed by the darkness. But what deeper horrors lay beneath these gods? What drove such lust for blood sex and soul-level domination? To truly understand the power behind the idols, we must go further into the spiritual engine that fueled them and the demonic beings that ruled over Canaan with an invisible iron grip. Are you prepared to see the faces behind the altars, to uncover the true masters of Canaanite worship? The next step will take us into their temples and beyond. To truly grasp the chilling depths of this spiritual abyss, we must venture closer into the dark heart of the Canaanite faith itself. And at the center of this swirling darkness stands Baal. His name rolls through the pages of the Old Testament like ominous thunder, leaving traces of dread wherever it appears. Baal was not merely another idol statue gathering dust in a forgotten temple corner. He was the towering centerpiece of the Canaanite religious universe, the blazing sun around which all their idolatrous practices orbited. In fact, Baal stood as the single greatest spiritual rival to Yahweh, the God of Israel. The very meaning of his name in Hebrew, Lord or Master, reveals the frightening grip he held over the hearts of the Canaanite people. To them, Baal was no distant myth or poetic metaphor. He was the living force behind the rains, the one who cracked open the heavens and drenched the earth so that grain would sprout and vines would swell heavy with grapes. Baal was the spirit of war, the overseer of victory, the breath behind every bountiful harvest, and for many, the very keeper of life itself. Can you imagine dwelling in a land where your daily bread, your children's survival, and your nation's security were all believed to rest in the volatile favor of such a being? Visualize how they carved his image, young, strong, brimming with energy, often brandishing a lightning bolt, a sign that he ruled the skies. The Canaanites clung to this image, desperately convinced that when Baal chose to smile, the rivers would run full and the fields would burst green and lush. But when drought stalked the land, their hearts trembled. They believed Baal had descended into a seasonal death, and it was then that they orchestrated dark, frenzied rituals to awaken him. Isn't it striking how close this comes to truth, yet remains profoundly twisted? They longed for resurrection, but looked for it in a false god. And here is where the horror truly begins. The worship of Baal was a perverse tapestry, woven with ritualized lust, spiritual corruption, and rivers of innocent blood. To rouse Baal's favor, men and women flocked to temple courtyards where they lay with consecrated prostitutes. They acted out the union of Baal with Ashtaroth in lurid public ceremonies, believing that by mimicking this divine coupling, they could provoke Baal to replicate it in the heavens, pouring rain upon their parched lands. What God had designed to be the sacred, tender bond of marriage became nothing more than a grotesque stage act to manipulate the supernatural. Can you feel the weight of this blasphemy? The intimate gift of sexuality, meant to unite husband and wife in holy covenant, was twisted into a carnival of ritualized fornication, stripped of dignity and reverence, and it only grew darker. For sometimes when the crops failed or disaster loomed, their devotion plunged to even more appalling depths. They offered human sacrifices. Some traditions say even firstborn children to buy Baal's mercy. Imagine standing amid a crowd watching trembling hands place a living child into burning arms, hoping his screams would melt the heart of a god made of stone. Could your soul survive witnessing such a scene without shattering? This was no fringe cult whispering in hidden caves. Baal worship was an official institution propped up by entire networks of priests and priestesses, endorsed by kings and woven into the daily rhythm of Canaanite life. Altars dedicated to Baal rose proudly alongside the idols of Asherah, visually proclaiming an unholy marriage between male and female demonic powers. These weren't just local oddities, they were societal pillars. And this intoxicating system of worship did not remain safely beyond Israel's borders. Its seductive pull seeped right into God's chosen nation. Think of Ahab, king of Israel, who built a towering temple for Baal in the very land Yahweh had sanctified for himself. Picture the prophet Elijah on Mount Carmel, standing alone against hundreds of Baal's prophets in that breathtaking spiritual showdown, recorded in 1 Kings 18. The fire that fell from heaven that day wasn't just about consuming a sacrifice. It was a direct confrontation between the living God and the dark power Baal represented. Yet, even after such displays of divine might, how often did Israel hesitate, torn between the one who brought them out of Egypt and the alluring promises of Baal's altars? For Baal was more than a carved figure. He was the embodiment of a complete spiritual system, a worldview promising instant blessings, sensual pleasures, and broad societal acceptance, all at the horrifying price of one's very soul. Does it strike you that some temptations haven't changed much, even now? And if Baal reigned as the chief deity, who then stood by his side whispering further seductions into the hearts of worshippers, the answer draws us deeper still into this midnight world of Canaanite idolatry. It was Ashtaroth, the goddess of sex war and irresistible allure, whose story we will uncover next as we continue to explore the dreadful depths of a religion that dared to challenge the holiness of God Himself. Are you prepared to see just how far humanity can fall when it chases false gods? If Baal ruled over fertility and storms, Ashtaroth, also known in neighboring lands as Astarte or Ishtar, stood as his consort revered across Canaan as the formidable mother goddess. But be careful not to let that title fool you. She was no gentle guardian of life, no divine nurturer, radiating warmth and compassion. Instead, Ashtaroth embodied a terrifying distortion. She was the spirit of unrestrained sensuality of war, drenched in bloodlust of religious ecstasy, stripped of all purity. Imagine living in a world where motherhood was recast not as tender care, but as seductive power, where feminine influence was measured by provocative allure and capacity to incite frenzy. This was the reality the Canaanites embraced. Her worship was so deeply woven into their daily lives that it shaped how entire generations viewed femininity, marriage pleasure, and even the sacred. Scripture lays bare just how entangled Ashtaroth's cult became with that of Baal. Judges 2:13 pierces like a lament, and they forsook the Lord and served Baal and Ashtaroth. Side by side, they stood a blasphemous pair that together mirrored a kind of perverse divine marriage, locking the people into cycles of lust, false hope, and spiritual slavery. Can you sense how this unholy union cast a long, dark shadow across the land, promised to a holy nation? Visual depictions of Ashtaroth left no doubt about her nature. Sculptors carved her with exaggerated feminine features, ample, brazen, enticing her form, captured in postures that invited rather than concealed. Each curve and flourish was designed to celebrate sensual power, to proclaim that pleasure, without restraint, was the highest devotion. Around her altars, poles known as asherim rose skyward symbols that at first glance might seem innocent, even picturesque, like groves waving in the breeze. But beneath these so-called sacred groves unfolded scenes of shocking abandon. Temple prostitution wasn't a dark rumor whispered by enemies. It was openly practiced, institutionalized as an act of worship. Can you picture entire families passing by children catching glimpses of rituals that twisted the most private gift God gave humanity into a public spectacle performed under the approving gaze of Ashtaroth's priests? Here, bodies designed by God to be holy vessels, living temples for His Spirit, were reduced to tools and ceremonies meant to honor demons masquerading as gods. Does it not send a chill through you to realize how thoroughly the sacred was inverted? And perhaps most chilling of all, it worked at least by human reckoning. The Canaanites firmly believed that these acts of ritual sensuality unlocked tangible blessings. Fields grew green herds, multiplied sons and daughters were born. In their eyes, Ashtaroth delivered what she promised, no matter the moral cost. But her dominion didn't end with lust. Ashtaroth was also the goddess of war. Picture this contradiction bound into one terrifying deity. Warriors would march off to battle with her name on their lips, pledging that if victory came, they would return to stage drunken orgiastic festivals in her honor where lust and violence mingled freely. In her cult Eros and Thanatos, pleasure and death merged on the same blood-streaked altar. Can you imagine the unsettling power of such a figure? A goddess who promised the thrill of passion and the savage glory of conquest in one hand. Little by little, what began as purely Canaanite corruption began to infect Israel itself. 1 Samuel 7:3-4 paints a tragic picture of just how deep the infiltration ran. There we find Samuel pleading with the Israelites to put away their strange gods, explicitly naming Ashtaroth evidence that this seductive worship had rooted itself among a people called to be holy. Does it not strike you as tragic that those chosen to carry the very name of Yahweh were found bowing before poles and groves dedicated to a goddess who embodied everything he despised? And isn't it sobering to think how seamlessly the Canaanites blended spirituality with perversion, offering a religion that titillated the senses, required no moral boundaries, and appeared to reward its devotees with prosperity and victory? This was the moral chasm into which they gleefully plunged, dragging others with them. Ashtaroth stood as a living testament to how far humanity could fall when it chose indulgence over integrity, passion over purity. Yet as dark as her cult was, Ashtaroth did not reign alone. Standing even further in the abyss was another god, one who did not merely distort life's sacred pleasures, but demanded its outright destruction. This was Molech, the devourer of children, whose altars smoked with the lives of innocents. As we press onward, we will descend yet another step into this ghastly underworld of Canaanite worship. Are you prepared to see just how horrifying rebellion against God can become when lust, violence, and blood converge in a single act of so-called devotion? Among all the unspeakable abominations practiced by the Canaanites, nothing plunges us deeper into darkness than the worship of Molech. This was the very pit of pagan idolatry, the final descent into moral insanity. Molech was not simply another name in their long roster of false gods. He was the ghastly climax of all their corruption, standing as a sinister monument to humanity's capacity for evil when completely untethered from divine truth. Unlike Baal, who supposedly brought rain, or Ashtaroth, who promised sensual delight and victory, Molech had no interest in songs of praise. He cared nothing for incense rising on perfumed winds or for ornate ceremonies laden with flowers and chants. Molech's appetite was far more monstrous. He demanded the most precious treasure any society could offer its children. Can you grasp the horror of that? The very future of a family, the innocent breath of new life, laid willingly upon a furnace for a demon in disguise. God's word confronts this horror with sharp, unyielding clarity. In Leviticus 18:21, the Lord thunders a command that still burns across millennia. And thou shalt not let any of thy seed pass through the fire to Molech, neither shalt thou profane the name of thy God. I am the Lord. This was no mere cultural taboo. Sacrificing children was a vile profanity, a direct assault upon God's sacred name. It wasn't just the murder of the innocent. It was a ritualized rebellion that spit in the face of the Creator, who formed those tiny lives in the secret places of the womb. Picture, if you can bear it, how these grim ceremonies unfolded. Towering iron idols shaped into grotesque hybrids, often with the muscular body of a man and the snarling head of a bull. stood in prominent places. Their hollow bellies roared with fire flames licking the insides of outstretched metal arms that glowed an ominous red. Into these burning arms, parents would place their own children, small living bodies trembling with confusion and terror. The priests, cloaked in their dark vestments, would beat drums and blow flutes so loudly that the air itself seemed to shake, all to drown out the cries that would have torn any compassionate heart to shreds. Does your mind recoil from this image? It should. This was hell on earth camouflaged as holy devotion. At this stage, Canaanite religion crossed a point of no return. This was more than sexual perversion or idol worship. It was an utter capitulation to demonic dominion. Child sacrifice wasn't some hidden vice whispered about in scandal. It was a sanctioned, celebrated event woven into the very fabric of Canaanite society. Communities gathered, watched, and nodded in solemn approval as the innocent were consumed, believing these deaths secured victories in war, overflowing granaries, and favor from their monstrous god. Tragically, this depravity did not stop at the borders of Canaan. It seeped like poison into the hearts of Israel, God's own chosen people. In 2 Kings 23:10, we find a chilling testament to how deep this influence reached. There we read how righteous King Josiah defiled Topheth in the valley of the son of Hinnom explicitly, so that no man might make his son or his daughter to pass through the fire to Molech. Can you feel the grief in those words? Israel, the nation set apart to shine with God's holiness, had sunk so low that they mimicked the very horrors Yahweh had called them to drive out. And is it not frightening to consider how a society could ever reach such depths? Molech stands as more than just an artifact of ancient idolatry. He embodies the inevitable end when a people abandons all reverence for God's holiness, when sin stops being hidden and becomes a culture, when the worship of demons is dressed up as tradition and unspeakable crimes are solemnly passed off as sacred duty. Molech is the final face of spiritual deception, the moment when humanity's conscience is so seared that what is most vile becomes not only accepted, but zealously defended. Pause for a breath. Can you imagine living among neighbors who viewed such atrocities, not with horror, but with reverence, who believed the louder the drums, the more certain the blessings? This is the moral abyss into which the Canaanites plunged, dragging countless others behind them. And so, as we stand on the edge of this pit and peer into the flames that once devoured the helpless, we begin to understand why God's judgment fell so heavily upon these nations. It was not a random act of cruelty. It was the necessary severing of a cancer that threatened to consume everything good, pure, and true. In Molech, we see the final terrifying consequence of what happens when a people completely reject the holy standards of the living God, exchanging his light for the seductive shadows of a lie. But as horrifying as the worship of Molech was in itself, what makes this all the more chilling is that it wasn't an isolated horror. Molech was merely one dark pillar in an entire towering system, a vast spiritual empire that the Canaanites had meticulously built. This was no chaotic patchwork of random superstitions. It was a sophisticated, well-organized religious framework, complete with temples, sacred texts, elaborate rituals, and priests who enforced doctrine with unwavering zeal. Can you imagine living in a society where the most depraved acts were not whispered about in hidden corners, but proudly displayed as central rights of life. This leads us to a piercing question that stands at the very heart of God's dealings with Canaan. What did the Lord see in these practices that was so spiritually poisonous, so vile, that he commanded with such crystal clarity the complete destruction of these nations? Why was there no room for compromise, no possibility of peaceful coexistence? The answer unfolds as we peer closer into the heart of Canaanite religion. In Leviticus 18, God opens a solemn ledger and lists one by one the atrocities that had stained this land incest, woven into family lines bestiality, accepted as part of worship temple prostitution, institutionalized as spiritual duty children, laid alive upon smoldering altars. And then he speaks words that cut to the core of divine justice. In verse 27, he declares, "For all these abominations have the men of the land done which were before you, and the land is defiled." Notice carefully, it wasn't only the people who were corrupted. The very soil beneath their feet was spiritually tainted, saturated by the works of darkness that had taken place upon it. Isn't it staggering to consider that sin can run so deep it seems to seep into the stones and fields themselves? Canaanite religion was a complete ecosystem of degradation. Their rituals formed a nightmarish blend of drunken revelry, public orgies, self-inflicted wounds, occult enchantments, and even episodes of spirit possession. The priests and priestesses didn't just lead chants, they became living conduits, mediums, overtaken by demonic forces, guiding their followers through ecstatic trances, orchestrating ceremonies that often spiraled into outright madness. In some circles, whispers of ritualized cannibalism further darkened their infamy. This was not just stray individuals falling into sin. It was an entire civilization diving headlong into the deepest shadows of corrupted spirituality. For Israel, idolatry posed far more than a distant cultural curiosity. It was a mortal threat to the very soul of the nation. Why? Because these Canaanite practices weren't cold, stern obligations, they were dazzling, indulgent, designed to thrill every carnal impulse. They promised pleasure without guilt, spiritual power without holiness, immediate satisfaction with no call to self-restraint. Isn't this precisely what the sinful heart of man craves even today? This is why God sounded the alarm again and again. "And ye shall not walk in the manners of the nation which I cast out before you." Leviticus 20:23. Could there be any clearer warning about how seductive and how deadly such a culture could be? Among the most scandalous of all their rites were the fertility festivals that erupted under the glow of full moon nights. Try to picture it. Hundreds gathered in torchlit groves, men and women mingling freely, young and old swept up together in mass orgies, performed at the feet of Baal and Ashtaroth's looming idols. Nearby priests prepared altars, slick with blood. Children were led forth for sacrifice drums. Thundered, flutes shrieked, and a raw tide of lust, fear, and violence surged like a living creature through the crowd. It was a worship that erased every line between the sacred and the obscene. Nothing was off limits. Everything was justified. It was a community-wide celebration of moral collapse. And crucially, this was not the periphery of their society. This was the very core. These weren't secret cults scuttling in alleyways. They were state-sponsored, endorsed by kings, regulated by priestly councils, taught to children as foundational truths of life. The Canaanites had constructed a towering edifice of spiritual perversion, complete with hierarchies, legal codes, and a complex ethic that twisted everything good into grotesque parody. Can you see now why God's fury was so kindled? Why his commands regarding these nations were so severe? Because these practices didn't just stand in casual disagreement with biblical truth. They were in absolute militant opposition to the holiness of God. So as we pull back and behold this vast organized network of abominations, we begin to understand. It wasn't about mere differences in culture or harmless diversity of worship. This was a direct, structured, and systematic rebellion against everything pure, righteous, and life-giving. A spiritual machine designed to enthrone demons and consume souls until God in his burning justice would rise to dismantle it once and for all. And if we're honest, doesn't it force us to ask, how close might our own world dance to such seductive shadows under new names and modern disguises? But faced with such staggering depths of iniquity, what did the Almighty do? Did he turn away unmoved as children burned on altars, as entire cities danced in orgiastic rites beneath demon idols? No, our God did not stand silent or indifferent. His response was as clear as it was terrifying, echoing across the centuries through the pages of Scripture. In Deuteronomy 20:17-18, the divine command rings out, "But thou shalt utterly destroy them, that they teach you not to do after all their abominations, which they have done unto their gods. So should ye sin against the Lord your God." This was no casual decree, no arbitrary stroke of cosmic cruelty. It was a moral and spiritual verdict pronounced by the judge of all the earth, a judgment announced long before and executed with divine precision when its time had fully come. Do you sense the weight of these words? They pull us directly into the heart of an essential question. What was the gravity of the Canaanites' sin that it demanded such an uncompromising sentence? And just as urgently, what does this reveal about the blazing holiness of God himself? Among all the solemn commandments ever given to Israel, before they set foot across the threshold of the Promised Land, none strikes modern ears more harshly, or even scandalously, than God's order to completely eradicate the nations inhabiting Canaan. It shocks us. It forces us to wrestle with divine justice in its most fearsome form. Yet through the lens of God's righteousness, what seems incomprehensible begins to take on a somber clarity. Listen again to the Lord's own words in Deuteronomy 20:16-18. "But of the cities of these people, which the Lord thy God doth give thee, for an inheritance, thou shalt save alive nothing that breatheth, but thou shalt utterly destroy them, that they teach you not to do after all their abominations." These were not simply military objectives. They were surgical strikes against a spiritual cancer that had metastasized so completely that not even a remnant could be left without grave danger of corrupting Israel. Can you imagine the dreadful responsibility that placed upon the Israelites to act not merely as conquerors, but as instruments of divine judgment? Because, make no mistake, this was not about expanding borders or swelling Israel's power. This was God himself executing sentence against a civilization drowning in deliberate, cultivated, and celebrated sin. The Canaanites were not innocent bystanders caught off guard by a sudden storm of wrath. For centuries, they had chosen to bathe their land in blood, to open their bodies and families to demons, to raise their children in shadow rather than light. The patience of God toward them is one of the most staggering testaments to his long-suffering. in all of Scripture. In Genesis 15:16, we catch a remarkable glimpse into God's timetable when he told Abraham that his descendants would not yet inherit the land, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. 4 long generations would pass, 4 centuries in which the Canaanites continued to build altars of fire for infants, to dance in sacred groves, to the beat of drunken drums, to plunge deeper into covenants with spirits that warred against the Most High. Isn't it sobering to realize that even then, God's mercy waited, granting them time-space, countless seasons in which to turn back. Yet instead of repentance, the people of Canaan only entrenched themselves further. Their high places multiplied, their orgies grew more brazen, their sacrifices more frequent and grisly. They normalized what God called abomination, teaching their children to revel in practices that would have made even hardened hearts recoil. Until finally, the cup of their iniquity was full, brimming to the top, leaving no room for further delay. At that point, divine justice, long restrained, thundered forth, not with random fury, but with the solemn inevitability of a verdict that could no longer be postponed. Can you feel the tension of this story? A holy God, infinitely patient, yet uncompromising in his purity, watching generation after generation slide deeper into darkness until mercy itself required judgment to keep creation from being utterly defiled. This is why the conquest of Canaan was framed not merely as a military campaign, but as a sacred duty to cleanse a land saturated by rituals so vile they stained the very soil. It was an act of protective justice, sparing Israel from falling under the same seductive spell. For the temptations of Canaan were not weak or subtle. They were thrilling, indulgent, promising pleasures without holiness, spirituality without submission power, without obedience. Could Israel have survived spiritually had these influences remained unchecked among them? So as we wrestle with these accounts, let them drive us deeper into awe at the blazing holiness of God, a holiness that cannot coexist with darkness that loves too fiercely to tolerate the destruction of souls by sin. And let it stir a question in our own hearts. What high places or seductive compromises do we tolerate, hoping God's patience will outlast our stubbornness? Because if history teaches us anything, it is that while mercy waits, long judgment eventually stands to preserve what is good, pure, and eternally true. When the measure of iniquity was finally full, when the cup of sin could hold no more, the decree from heaven descended like a blade, total purification of the land. It was not an impulsive verdict, nor the outburst of a capricious deity. It was the solemn pronouncement of a righteous judge whose patience had been stretched across centuries, who had watched with grief as darkness took deeper root with each generation. Can you sense the weight of this? The land itself groaned under the stain of countless sacrifices, perversions, and chants lifted to demons instead of to the Creator. It is crucial to grasp that God in His justice does not act with favoritism. He is utterly impartial, so much so that the very standard by which He judged the Canaanites would later be applied to Israel itself when they chose to walk the same treacherous paths. The conquest and destruction of the Canaanite nations were not simply about clearing territory for Abraham's descendants. They stood as a chilling historical and spiritual lesson etched into time to declare forever that the Lord does not tolerate institutionalized sin, least of all when it wears the robes of religion. For when false worship becomes not just personal folly, but an entire culture-sanctioned system. When idols are enthroned and wicked rituals celebrated, sin transforms into a refined, audacious rebellion that demands holy judgment. Yet there was more than punishment here. God's command to destroy carried a protective purpose that burned with fatherly concern. He knew the fragile hearts of his people. He knew how easily human eyes are dazzled by sensual rites, by exotic festivals that promise crops, children, victories, pleasures. If Israel lived side by side with the Canaanites, it was only a matter of time before curiosity turned into imitation and imitation into covenant. And tragically, that is precisely what unfolded when they failed to obey the divine directive completely. Time and again, the people fell under the spell of Canaanite gods, offering incense on forbidden altars, allowing their daughters and sons to be lured into marriages that wove pagan practices into Israel's very heart. Isn't it sobering to realize how a single thread of compromise can unravel an entire tapestry of faith? So this judgment was not only an ending for the Canaanites, it was meant to be a sacred beginning for Israel. The land needed to be cleansed, not just of inhabitants, but of the heavy spiritual pollution that saturated every stone tree grove and high place. Only then could it be consecrated as the ground where God's name would dwell, where sacrifices of true worship would rise from Solomon's temple, and one distant day where the feet of the Messiah himself would tread. Have you ever thought that even the soil of Bethlehem, where Jesus was born, was once claimed by Canaan's abominations and had to be purified to cradle the incarnate Son of God? This divine judgment thunders out an unchanging truth. God's holiness is non-negotiable. Yes, he is exceedingly patient, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love. But there comes a moment when the iniquity of a people festers to such a point that it corrodes everything. Morality collapses. Families are twisted. Worship is hijacked. And even governments become instruments of darkness. Then the same long-suffering God unsheathes the sword of justice. The destruction of the Canaanites thus becomes a mirror held up to every nation, every culture, every generation. It shows in stark relief just how seriously God regards collective sin and cultural idolatry, especially when it masquerades under the trappings of spirituality. Could this divine standard one day be held against any society that institutionalizes what God calls abomination, celebrates what he declares corrupt, and invites children to dance in the very shadows he came to banish? In the end, these ancient stories are not dry records of long-dead civilizations. They pulse with warnings and lessons for us today. For the God who commanded the purification of Canaan is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And his call to holiness still echoes through time, inviting us to uproot every hidden idol, every secret compromise, so that our hearts and lands might be truly fit for his dwelling. But the story does not end there. In fact, it unfolds into a heartbreaking sequel, a divine tragedy etched across generations. For despite God's crystal clear warnings, his chosen people did what we might least expect. They let the influence of Canaan seep into their hearts, into their homes, into their very worship. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, they allowed false gods to cross the threshold of their cities. They raised Asherah poles on the very soil God had sanctified. They mixed sacred offerings with practices once deemed unthinkable. The worship of the living God became diluted, compromised, and eventually contaminated by the very idolatry they were commanded to uproot. And what became of Israel for tolerating what should have been destroyed? The terrifying precision of God's earlier warnings came to life before their eyes. They became living examples of divine words spoken long before they faltered. In Judges 2:2-3, God's rebuke rings with sorrow and sternness, and ye shall make no league with the inhabitants of this land. Ye shall throw down their altars, but ye have not obeyed my voice. Why have ye done this? Wherefore I also said, I will not drive them out from before you. But they shall be as thorns in your sides, and their gods shall be a snare unto you. Can you feel the weight of that divine lament? What might it have felt like to hear God himself ask, why have you done this? And what he foretold happened exactly. Like a silent poison coursing through unseen veins, Canaanite influence infiltrated Israel's heart. Altars to Baal sprang up across the land of promise, not only in hidden groves, but in public spaces where once only Yahweh's name had been honored. Asherah poles were erected again and again, as though the lessons of judgment on Canaan had vanished like smoke. Practices the Israelites once recognized as vile abominations gradually seemed less offensive, then somewhat acceptable, then outright embraced. Isn't it haunting how sin so often follows that same subtle path, first shocking, then normal, then celebrated? Eventually, even the horror of child sacrifice, the very practice that had summoned God's fierce judgment on Canaan, was revived by kings of Judah. Ahaz, followed by Manasseh, led God's own covenant people into burning their sons and daughters in the fire. What God had explicitly forbidden, what he had judged with the sword of divine justice, was now welcomed into Jerusalem itself. The spiritual rot did not stop at the altar. It spread outward, corroding Israel socially, economically, and politically. The once united nation splintered, crumbling under internal strife, stumbling from one humiliating defeat to another, until finally they were carried off into exile by foreign conquerors. Can you see the tragic symmetry? The land God had purified from Canaanite abominations became like Canaan again, and so it received a judgment eerily similar. The Babylonian captivity, with its chains and tears by the rivers of a foreign land, was in large measure the inevitable harvest of seeds sown long before, when God's people chose tolerance over obedience, cultural comfort over covenant faithfulness. The deepest tragedy of it all was not merely political downfall, but spiritual betrayal. The people exchanged the blazing glory of the living God for mute idols, false gods of wood and stone that could neither hear their cries nor lift a hand to save them. They abandoned fountains of living water in favor of cracked, leaking cisterns that could hold no blessing, as God mourned through the prophet in Jeremiah 2:13. For my people have committed two evils. They have forsaken me, the fountain of living waters, and hewed them out. Cisterns, broken cisterns that can hold no water. Could there be a more tragic indictment? Israel's descent serves as an eternal warning etched across history. When idolatry becomes comfortable, when the prevailing culture starts to dictate the terms of our devotion rather than God's unchanging word, the end is always ruin. The command to destroy the Canaanites was never born from cruelty. It sprang from divine mercy, a desperate act by a loving God to preserve his people from a spiritual destruction far worse than any sword. Yet Israel's disobedience transformed that promised blessing into judgment, turned inheritance into ashes, and left future generations weeping over what might have been. And does this ancient lesson not still whisper urgently to us? In our own time, as subtle idols rise, and culture crafts its own seductive high places. Are we guarding our hearts with the same fervor God demanded of Israel? Or are we too at risk of letting what should have been driven out take root among us until it becomes our snare, our thorn, and ultimately our undoing? Yet even in the midst of all this overwhelming corruption, a striking contrast emerges, one that grows sharper with every account and more radiant against the dark backdrop of Canaanite depravity. The God of Israel, wholly just patient and unwaveringly faithful, stands in stark opposition to the fickle, cruel, powerless deities of Canaan. When we truly set them side by side, we see that we are not merely comparing different cultural beliefs or ritual systems. We are beholding a collision of two diametrically opposed spiritual kingdoms. Consider the very nature of the God revealed to Israel. He is unblemished in purity, perfect in righteousness, steadfast and unchanging, a fountain brimming over with mercy and truth. His heart burns with compassion, yet stands immovable in justice. How different from the mocking pantheon of Canaan, Baal, Ashtaroth. Molech, mere masks for demonic spirits, each one a sinister embodiment of deception, lust, violence, manipulation, and the grossest perversions of what God intended humanity to be. Look closer at how they rule over hearts. The true God created human beings in his own sacred image, crowning them with dignity, calling them to live in justice to reflect his character in the world. The Canaanite gods twisted this design beyond recognition, reducing people to mere instruments of carnal pleasure, fleeting thrills, and primal instinct. Where God says, "Be holy, for I am holy," Baal roars, "Come and indulge without restraint." Where God calls for sincere repentance to restore shattered souls, Molech demands innocent blood poured out on searing bronze. The Lord treasures and protects the family, raising it as a fortress of love and nurture. Ashtaroth desecrates it, draping it in sensuality and parading it through ritual debauchery. In every facet, there is a direct, violent confrontation between the Creator, who breathes life, and the demons masquerading as gods who feed on corruption and death. Notice also how God's revelation came to Israel, not shrouded in chaotic impulses or savage rituals, but wrapped in clear moral commandments, ethical laws, and a divine summons to embody both justice and mercy. In Deuteronomy 6:4-5, we hear a cry that still echoes across history. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord, and thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thine heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy might. This was more than an instruction. It was a covenant of exclusive devotion, a sacred call to fidelity that left no room for divided loyalties. Imagine what it meant to hear those words for the first time at the foot of Sinai, knowing the God who thundered them was the same who split seas and crushed Egypt's might. Meanwhile, the Canaanites staggered through life, serving a multitude of gods, bowing to every fresh passion that rose within them, worshiping according to impulses that left no boundary untouched. Their religion was a playground of promiscuity and perversion, draped in elaborate rituals that masked hollow spiritual emptiness. And what did they worship? Handcrafted statues carved from wood, hammered from metal, chiseled from cold stone. Objects that could neither breathe nor speak, could not see distress, nor hear desperate cries. Lifeless, powerless, utterly devoid of spirit. Contrast this to the God of Israel, alive, moving, burning with presence. He did not sit silent on a pedestal. He spoke from fire and whirlwind. He guided his people by a pillar of cloud by day and fire by night, He shattered the pride of Pharaoh's split rocks to pour forth water-dropped manna from the skies, and delivered Israel time and again with an outstretched arm. Where the idols only took demanding sacrifice after sacrifice, yet offering nothing in return, the Lord promised and unfailingly fulfilled. Isn't it breathtaking to consider that while idols demanded bodies, God gave bread? While Molech devoured children, Yahweh preserved them, marking doorposts with lamb's blood to shield them from death. This is why idolatry among Israel was not simply about swapping one set of religious customs for another. It was a catastrophic spiritual betrayal. It meant turning away from the fountain of living waters to dig cracked cisterns that could hold no life, as Jeremiah 2:13 laments. For my people have committed two evils. They have forsaken me, the fountain of living waters, and hewed them out. Cisterns, broken cisterns that can hold no water. It was abandoning the one true God who redeems, restores, and reigns to chase after mute, deceptive spirits dressed up as divine. The entire biblical narrative is thus far more than a chronicle of battles and shifting territories. It is a cosmic drama, a theological conflict that pits the God who saves against the gods who corrupt. It is a relentless unveiling of two kingdoms, one of light, life, and truth, the other of darkness, death, and seductive lies. And though the names have changed, the core confrontation remains just as fierce today. Modern altars may not drip with literal blood or echo with temple flutes drowning children's screams, but the seductions of power, pleasure, and false spirituality still lure countless hearts away from the living God. So, the question that rang out over ancient Canaan still pierces through time to reach us. Whom will you serve? Will it be the God who shapes eternity, who carves your name on his hands, who poured out his own blood so that yours might be spared? Or will it be the myriad idols of culture pleasure, self-promising much but delivering nothing demanding, all yet giving only chains? In the end, this choice defines everything, then and now. It shapes destinies, builds or breaks nations, and decides the fate of souls. What will your answer be? So, as we stand back and take in the sweeping tragedy and triumph woven through the story of the Canaanites and Israel, what remains is far more than an ancient record of forgotten peoples and crumbled altars. It is a living mirror, reflecting both the dangers that lurk when we compromise with darkness and the unmatched beauty of a God who calls us to holiness, not to deprive us, but to protect us, to set us apart for something higher and eternally meaningful. At the core of all this history lies a sobering truth. What consumed Canaan was not just idolatry and ritual, but idolatry in the heart, a giving over to instincts, passions, cultural pressures, until the sacred was utterly profaned. And what broke Israel was not the might of foreign armies, but the slow erosion that came when they let the culture around them dictate the shape of their devotion. What God intended to be, a people who would shine as a beacon of His holiness, became tarnished by the very shadows they were meant to dispel. Isn't this same tension alive today? We live in a world that constantly lifts up new altars, celebrating self above sacrifice, pleasure above purity, power above compassion, feelings above truth. The names have changed, but the principles have not. Baal still whispers through our pursuit of instant gratification. Ashtaroth still beckons through the glamorization of sensuality and the tearing down of family boundaries. Molech still demands innocent blood though now cloaked in more modern justifications. And the call of God remains the same, to come out from among them and be separate, to love Him with all our heart, soul, and might. But there is also hope, radiant, breathtaking hope. Because the God who judged Canaan and disciplined Israel is the same God who sent His own Son to bear the weight of our rebellion, who now writes His law upon willing hearts, and who calls each of us into a covenant, not of fear, but of love and redemption. He does not merely want to purge lands. He longs to cleanse souls, to make us living temples where His Spirit dwells. So perhaps the deepest lesson from this entire narrative is an invitation to examine our own lives. Are there places where we've grown comfortable with cultural idols? Have we allowed what should have been driven out to take root and thrive? What subtle agreements have we made with values and practices that stand opposed to the holiness of God? Let this story inspire you to choose differently, to tear down every hidden altar, to refuse the easy seductions of a world that promises much, but always takes more than it gives. To stand firmly for the God who alone can satisfy, who alone can save. If this message has stirred something within you, take a moment to respond. Share your thoughts in the comments. It not only strengthens your own journey, but encourages others who are walking this path of faith alongside you. Make sure you're subscribed so you won't miss future videos that continue to explore these deep spiritual truths. And if you feel led to support this work, your generosity through super thanks or sharing these messages with others helps us reach even more people hungry for the Word. May you walk in the light of God's holiness and love, anchored not by fleeting idols, but by the one who was and is and forever will be.